retention levels, and hear about real-life membership body case studies that will bring the topic to life. So hopefully that's what you're expecting with us today. So in terms of today's speakers, we've got obviously myself, Rich. I'm the chair of the network. I'm also joined by Steve Shields, who's head of product at Militech. And good morning to you, Steve. Hope you're well. And you there, Steve?
Morning.
Okay. And we've also got Ed Owen on, who's strategic account director at Militech. Good morning to you too, Ed.
Morning, everyone.
And of course, Kerry will be joining us to make sure that we're all behaving today, and will be moderating the questions that get put forward. So in terms of today's session, here we go. So just to set the scene, I just wanted to provide a quick slide before we move into today's core session. So ultimately, member engagement and retention are two of the top 3 priorities for the membership sector at the moment. And those figures came from the Digital Excellence 2022 research that we conducted with about 740 associations. So it's within our top 3 priorities, so 2 of the 3. Now, the number of us that actually have a member engagement strategy and plan in place is actually lower than what we think it should be. So at the moment, only 29% of membership organisations actually have a structured member engagement strategy and plan in place. And we think it's time to do something about that. That number does increase in slightly larger organisations. So medium to large membership organisations are more likely to have a plan and a strategy in place. We think that that's too low also. And obviously, as a network, we're keen to advocate taking more structured approaches, and hopefully that gives credence to today's topic. So a quick signposting from me. We do have a member engagement strategy and plan template that is available on MemberWise Connect. You can actually download that for free and use that as a template if you're going to find that helpful, if you're going from nothing to having a strategy and plan in place, or perhaps you want to quality assure the plan and strategy that you're currently using. So both purposes there, more than welcome to download that. And I think it's been downloaded something like 1,000 times. So we're constantly updating that. So please do take a look at that. Also, when it comes to member engagement, it's going to be one of the key topics that we're looking at within our next national conference, which is Digital Excellence 2022, which is on the 26th of May in London. And in terms of our sponsor today, Militech, they will be going to that event. So if you want to talk member engagement, particularly online member engagement and interactive, this is definitely an event worth looking at. And I know that Militech will be sharing a discount code with you today if you've not already registered your place. So in terms of today, I'm going to hand over to Ed, and Ed is going to start off with the first presentation. So over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Rich. I will do the screen sharing. 2 seconds.
That looks great.
You can see that okay, yeah?
Yeah, looks great.
Fantastic. Okay, well, as welcome everybody. Thanks for making the time as usual. It seems Steve and I were only talking to a few of you, I'm sure, like a month ago, I think it was, Steve. I'm not sure quite where the time's gone, but this is sort of a natural follow-on from the last topic we did, which is about member engagement, as Rich said. And now we're sort of focusing and diving into retention specifically. So the plan is sort of to give sort of high-level our thoughts on it, talk about real-life examples, and hopefully give you some practical things that you can start thinking about, start applying to your organisation. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so either put some questions in the chat or save the questions till the end, and we'll do our best to cover those off. So I'll start off just loosely on the agenda, very high-level retention, why it matters. Rich has already sort of set the scene for that. Then we want to specifically talk about proactive and reactive in terms of retention strategies. And then Steve's going to help me in terms of padding that out and giving you guys some context around different strategies we've worked with clients on, and just some general best practice that goes along with that. And as I said, at the end, there'll be Q&A. So any questions, we'll pick those up then. So retention, what is it? Why does it matter? Thankfully, this one's slightly easier to explain than engagement, which I find is different per organisation and think about things slightly differently. But specifically, it's like, realistically, do your members stick around? And for membership, that's quite important. In a webinar I did way back when on KPIs, we talked about acquisition and retention being sort of the 2 key pillars of membership. And as Rich said, member retention, which is here, was one of the top 3 things that was a priority for membership organisations in the Digital Excellence Report. So it's definitely very prominent, and obviously so, because for a membership to sort of grow, it needs to retain its members. So sort of 3 key benefits of retention versus acquisition, for example, is it's cost effective. So once you've got the members, you've sort of invested that time, energy to get members to join, then we want to make sure it can be lighter touch, more cost effective to retain those members versus going out and acquiring new members. It provides your organisation with improved stability, financial or otherwise, in terms of having a solid set of members that stick around and are loyal. And then, as I've already sort of mentioned, it allows for growth. So if you're going to grow as a membership organisation, you can't have that leaky bucket syndrome, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of. But if you're losing members faster than you're gaining new members, then your growth is going to stagnate or decline. So that's kind of 3 key benefits of retention. One other thing I wanted to mention as well is member lifetime value. So this is a play on customer lifetime value. But essentially, this represents the income that you would get from a member in this case. And very, very simply, what we're talking about here is the membership value that you derive from that member. So that's how much they pay you essentially over the course of their membership. And then that's a multiple of the duration of that membership. So annual membership value multiplied by the duration in years. And pretty self-explanatory, but if you can increase the retention, you increase that duration of membership, and therefore you increase the lifetime value of that member. So it's quite important, and it can have a real significant impact by even just increasing that by a year or 2 versus where it might be at the moment. So just, again, another benefit of retention and why it's so important. In the context of member retention, it's one of the things that's quite important is think, how are you going to track this? How are we going to see whether we're performing, or what's the sort of rate in which our retention compares to others in the sector? So again, this is quite a simplistic starting point, but we wanted to give you at least a framework to consider when you're looking at your retention. So essentially what you're after is what percentage of your members stick around. So to simply do that, you want to start by looking at the total members that you have at an end of a given period, and that'll be relevant for your organisation. So it might be that you want to look at this on an annually basis, maybe it's monthly or quarterly, and you want to divide that by the amount of people that you had at the start of that period. Now, again, very simplistic, you know that you might have new members that you want to discount from that, but just very simply, you want to look at how many did you start with, how many did you end with. That will give you a decimal point, and then you times that by 100 to get a percentage. So it's a little bit early for equations, but to give you a quick example, if we consider a period of 12 months, and we say at the end of December, we had 1,200 members, but we started in January with 1,500 members, then that would give us a retention rate of 80%. I guess that inevitably asks the question, what's a good percentage? And that's going to depend on your organisation, a lot of variables. I think 100% would be fantastic, but I think it's almost realistically impossible. And all membership organisations will and should anticipate an element of churn. So inevitably, you're going to have members that will leave for varying different reasons. But anything, I would say, over 90% is a pretty fantastic retention rate. And the point being, this is a very high level view of a retention rate, but we can start to apply this in segmentation and different ways to make it more meaningful and inform your strategies. So a few bullet points from me on this, and then Steve, when he's talking a little bit more in detail on examples, can sort of relate this to those examples. So consider it for different member profiles. So what I just said then was how many people were at the start of the year, how many of the people at the end of the year, but you might want to segment that further. So how many new joiners, how many people that have been in membership over a year, over 2 years, different age demographics, those sorts of things. And then you can have a retention rate for each of those segments. Use this as a monitoring of performance. So you can say, how was my retention at the start of the year? How was it post-campaign? So it's something that you can actually tangibly use to monitor how you're doing. And then combine this with the member lifetime value to generate a return on investment. So this is particularly important if you're thinking about investing. Let's, for example, say you're going to send out some communications, physical communications, you're going to do printing, there's costs associated with that. So you can monitor that and say, well, the lifetime value is X. And if we can increase that, we'll get this return on that investment. So it's a way of helping you make those decisions around if it's a good investment or not. And what's my next slide? So the next thing then, that's sort of why it's important, a very simplistic way at this stage of how you can start to track your retention. And then retention strategies, what we want to get into is sort of how do you improve that? And we would think of this in two different sides. So you've got proactive retention and reactive retention. And very simply, proactive is where you're going out to your members to try and influence the outcome, and the outcome of being, will they renew their membership? And reactive is being more responsive to, hang on, my member hasn't renewed their membership. What do I now do to try and make sure they do? So it's that sort of prevention cure type of thing. And obviously they influence each other. So you might proactively be trying to do a campaign up front, and then you'll be recording whether that's working and maybe taking different courses of action if they don't renew. So they do both complement each other. And as I said, we'll be going into some more details on each of these in a sec. So this brings us nicely to our first interactive poll that Rich mentioned that we'd be bringing up. So if you are able to vote, that'd be great, really appreciated. So the question is, does your organisation currently have a defined retention strategy? And then the multiple choice is strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. So the question again is, does your organisation currently have a defined retention strategy? And then the options are strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. I'll give 30 seconds or so for you guys to answer. Obviously, it was quite interesting because Rich said in the seed setting said that we, across engagement and retention strategies, about 29% of organisations have one. So it'll be interesting to see how the answers marry up to this. Well, I suppose just immediate comments on that is strongly agree, I should say, is the lowest percentage on there. So that probably airs more towards neutral, disagree and agree in terms of probably a spattering of some have engagement strategies and maybe it doesn't cover all bases, and appreciate these answers aren't a catch-all for absolutely every edge case, but certainly paints a picture that there seems to be a strategy in place, but maybe there's area for improvement based on my interpretation of that. Perfect, thank you for your participating as well. Right, so Steve, I think if you're ready, I'm going to hand over to you now to talk a little bit more about proactive retention.
That's great, thanks Ed, and morning everybody. So what I want to do in the next section is touch on proactive retention strategies and the considerations, take a look at a couple of examples of where we've seen this in practice and how that's helped organisations to improve their retention. So first, just to do a bit of scene setting on proactive retention strategies. Where possible, proactive retention strategies should be forward planned in terms of the touch points that you intend to have with your members. I think that the key takeaway here is that member retention strategies do differ from engagement. It's a defined look at what is the value proposition for your organisation, and are your members feeling that value proposition? So having dedicated touch points with your customers to, in various shapes and forms, understand, take feedback and ensure that your members are feeling the benefit of your membership. It's crucial to utilise technology, of course, to help you in that member retention strategy and that communication. But also a great way of gathering that feedback is to utilise networks to reach members. So I'm sure many organisations on the webinar today will have special interest groups, regional groups, committees and so on, that are a great way of getting down into the weeds of membership and understanding the value that's being perceived from your membership and drive that feedback back into the business. And proactive retention strategies should be structured outbound communications, which are approached as a dedicated marketing plan. So quite often member retention is seen as a construct of membership departments in our experience. Member engagement may be getting messages out there on your products or services, the value that it can bring through engagement is often completed through marketing policies and practices, but ultimately when it comes to retention, it's kind of seen more as a membership process, and by bringing that structure and that planning and that strategy to retention, we can up the communication, make that more structured, and may increase the chances of members renewing their membership at the end of their renewal cycle. So there isn't ever going to be a one-size-fits-all strategy for retention. There are some considerations in terms of what you can do. So it will somewhat depend on size of organisation, type of membership, reason for being, and so on. So I see different strategies for organisations that are maybe providing more help, advice and support for members versus those that are perhaps delivering value-added learning services. The way in which interactions take place in those organisations do differ, and therefore the retention strategies of those organisations will differ subtly. Of course, the volume of members and the resources that you have available to contact members will differ, and therefore different strategies are required for different sizes and styles of organisation. The key point though is that regardless of size of organisation, endeavours and so on, retention focused communication, gathering feedback is a vital way of driving the value that your organisation is providing to your members and gathering feedback on whether that is not happening. So my first example today, I wanted to take a look at an organisational membership example. This comes from a membership body who their endeavours are to provide help, advice, support for their membership base, practical information, lobbying, events and so on. And in that particular organisation, they have a practice known as the Circle of Care. And this is a mandated policy almost with very defined SLAs, which sees a minimum amount of contact with each member organisation in their renewal year. Now, that organisation has a fairly large amount of organisation members, but it doesn't run into the thousands and the hundreds of thousands. I think it's about 1,500 altogether. And their organisation is built around regular communication with that member to create a feedback loop of information which can go back into products and services. So to explain the diagram that we have in front of us here, at the top of our circle of care we have the member joining, and within a couple of weeks of that member joining there will be a welcome communication and engagement, so an initial phone call to make sure that the member understands what membership is all about, where to go for help, advice and support and so on, and just signpost the touch points with the organisation and the products and services that are available. And then once that initial communication has happened, all members will receive a minimum of one face-to-face meeting with a business development manager per year and one outbound call per year. And the organisation uses their technology to make sure that those happen in the first half of the year and the second half of the year. So by way of guarantee, there will be a communication with the organisation in the first half of the year and the second half of the year to make sure that communication is regular. The topic of conversation is to take feedback on what's happening in the marketplace, feedback on the products and services that the organisation, the membership organisation provide, to talk about interactions with the organisations, to pick up any recurring themes, drive value in terms of cross-sell. Did you know that this event's taking place and this might be of use to you, and so on and so forth, and just really to keep in touch with that member to increase the chances of retaining that member at the end of the year. Now, of course, that's very mandated. It's very one size fits all. It works because they're giving their members equal attention almost, but that isn't going to happen in every single example. So we're now going to move on to our second example and take a look at how that may play out at organisations with a larger volume of individual members. And the principles of the circle of care actually, I think, are quite important here, but we want to make sure that we focus our efforts in on the correct groups of people. And the way to do that is to segment the higher volume of members into different segments so that we can create strategies aimed at each segment that are appropriate to the way that that segment behaves, communicates, and their demographics. So the crucial takeaway on this slide is that it's a case of using the data collected through your CRM and your websites and apps and so on to build a picture of the various segments that you have in your organization. So that might cover descriptive demographic and preference information that's been collected, a history of communications with your organization, and then an understanding of the behaviors. So services interactive with products used and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to move on at this stage to some potential examples of how we may break down the overall membership base. And we have 4 segments here, kept it fairly simple, highly engaged, engaged, disengaged, and highly disengaged segments. But fundamentally, the segments that you would use for your retention strategies would ultimately be tailored to your organisation. So just to deepen that further, I know that Rich did a report a few years ago now on the importance of Generation Z in the membership market and how that particular segment of people would have a very different membership experience to generations gone by. So using that demographic and preferential information may choose to segment further into a highly engaged Gen Z member and an engaged Gen Z member versus a highly engaged Gen X member that would have very different retention strategies based on where they hang out, as it were, how they interact with you as an organisation, what their expectations are from membership, so that we approach communications and feedback with those different groups in different ways, fundamentally. So moving into how we would do that practically, what we have in front of us here are our 4 high-level segments: highly engaged, engaged, disengaged, and highly disengaged members. And what we're putting in place here is a different communication strategy based on those groups. So by way of example, a highly engaged member may, for example, be a more regular visitor to your website than the other segments, and therefore the communication retention strategy might be more like engagement, personalization, reminders of the value that they're getting from their membership, playing back touch points in their my membership style area, so there's reminders of the value that they're driving, but not putting huge amounts of effort into real physical communications and feedback from those people. We know they're highly engaged, they're regular interactors. Let's reinforce that message as opposed to intervening. By comparison, an engaged member sounds fairly positive, but we might choose to have more overt communication in terms of email and driving. There really are examples of these stage, rather than an engaged member equals email. What we're trying to drive at here is that there will be different communication and retention conversations based on the segment that the individuals fall into. Picking up on our disengaged member, Ed's going to provide a real life example in a few moments' time of how phone calls was really important at a membership organisation in increasing member retention. And without it stealing Ed's thunder, I know when Ed relayed that story, it was a great example of how there was a perception that phone call maybe wouldn't work, but by targeting a particular cohort of people, the organisation was able to increase their member retention. And when it comes to the highly disengaged bracket, we may actually choose not to do anything with those people. They're not interacting with us. It's a waste of time and resources potentially, and therefore we're not going to try and move those into a more engaged segment. We accept that that's our churn and move on. So crucially, this is not a one-off process. The key is to collect the analytics through those processes of where those communications and strategies are working, and ultimately to refine A, segmentations. Have we picked the right segmentations? And B, is the communication strategy that we've curated for that particular segment actually working? Is it making them more engaged? Are they doing more with us? And your front end solutions and CRM solutions should be capable of driving that data collection and that analytics that will support you in those endeavors. I'll hand over to you now, Ed, for your client example.
Cheers, thank you, Steve. Yeah, so we just wanted to put a little bit of meat on bone to give you another example that we've seen quite recently. So I'm going to do a sort of user journey across the screen to explain it, but it's a large membership organisation, one of our clients, that was seeing inevitably some churn of new members joining. So it'd have a propensity of new members join, and then they wouldn't renew in the first year. So they undertook analysis of those members to sort of do the segmentation piece. So this was sort of the first point of saying, we've got these new joiners, and then let's define the sort of segment that we're seeing that's not renewing their membership. There was a few things, and as Steve pointed out, there's some highly disengaged members, and there's some assumptions here that you're going to have to start with before then you sort of refine that once you actually get some data. But that whittled it down to about 1/3 of the new joiners that we said that's the sort of group of members that we think can be receptive to an engagement campaign, and therefore potentially receptive to renewing, and we could increase the membership lifetime value. So the campaign now that's set up is that we take new joiners, that gets segmented based on the segmentation criteria that we set in place. That's about, as I said, about 1/3. That then gets passed into a call campaign. So it's set up in the back end system, and they get grouped into a call campaign. And then depending on the numbers and sort of where those members are based, it's either carried out internally within the regional groups, or it's actually done by a dedicated call team. We actually within the business have some call campaign services, so we've been able to support them with this for the larger volumes of calls when needed. But essentially the campaign is quite simplistic. So a new member joins, and then within the first 4 weeks we want to reach out to them with a personal phone call, and that phone call is to welcome them to the organisation, and then pretty much ask if they received their welcome pack, because that would go out typically within sort of immediately with them joining. And the point of that then is generally just touching base with them. It's having that personal conversation. There was an attempt to do that by email previously, but as I'm sure we've all experienced, it's you would think that might be the most effective way, but actually I think emails get quickly ignored and sometimes can have the opposite effect, where almost I'm getting bombarded with communications immediately from joining. So actually picking up the phone was quite a differentiator, because they wouldn't necessarily get that with other products and services they sign up with. So as soon as that campaign was taking place, then we automatically update that in the back-end system. So that will be the outcome of the call. And there might be follow-up actions off the back of that. For example, they didn't receive their welcome pack, so we need to reissue that. Or potentially they would like to inquire about something specific in their membership or assistance. So then we could pass that on to a dedicated team member, dedicated branch, region, so on and so forth. And then the key point is that we then have some data. Now, the tricky thing with retention is it's knowing the payoff and how much time you've got to wait. So we said in our calculation we had a period, and that was 12 months. So you might be carrying out this within a month of the member joining, and then you're not quite sure if it's going to pay off until the renewal point comes around in 11 months' time. So there are obviously, of course, variables that come in between that might impact whether a member renews or not, and it might not be actually down to your campaign. So it does make it tricky. But the results that they have seen, they've been doing this campaign over quite a period of time, is that the results of this are almost doubling the membership lifetime value. And quite simply, if they were not going to renew in the first membership year, they are at least extending into a second year. And then that is more than paying in terms of return on investment on the cost involved to run these campaigns. So it's becoming sort of a business as usual activity that they must undertake. But the key thing really to make that as efficient as possible is refining this segmentation. So it's learning which members are most receptive to those calls and which are therefore likely to renew, and then sort of filtering that in so you sort of forever get better at that segmentation piece. So that was just one practical example. It's something that I think all organizations could attempt, even at a smaller sort of level, and just try that out. And definitely the call aspect of it versus doing email campaigns, I think it's a good opportunity to get in contact with the member, and then if nothing else, you can try and gain some insights from them on the call. So yeah, that was just one example. Some key takeaways just before we go into another poll from that whole section. We've talked about this word a lot, but segmentation is really important. I think it's just making sure you're spending your time in the right way. Organizations have different volumes, as Steve said, so making that as effective as possible, and then considering different personalized communication channels and things that we think are going to be most receptive for those key segments. Identify the touch points and utilize your systems to help you do that. So CRM, websites, different touch points that your member interacts with. And then this monitoring of performance. So use your retention rates, consider that, consider your segmentation. How can you refine that over time and optimize? So we're going to go into a quick poll. Do you feel that better segmentation would help your retention strategy? And similar to before, the answers are strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. And I think the poll should pop up in a sec. There we go. Thanks, Kelly. So again, the question is, do you feel better segmentation would help your retention strategy? Strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree? Just give that a sec. Steve, I'll let you comment on the answers to this one.
And I think that's a fairly overwhelming result there in terms of agreement. I think that's a byproduct of better segmentation is, for me, one of the key ways of achieving more effective retention, engagement, and acquisition of potential members. It often feels to me like a key blocker to truly understanding who those people that you're interacting with are and driving strategies to improve that retention, engagement, acquisition. So yeah, I think an overwhelming result there.
Perfect. So, right. Steve, I think I'm going to pass back to you now to speak about reactive retention.
Yeah, that's great. So just as a start point on reactive retention, we're looking here more at what happens post renewal notice, renewal point hitting for the member, and what happens thereafter. If I can get you to move on to the next slide, Ed. So just in terms of scene setting, in my experience, retention strategies are more common than proactive retention strategies. Quite often it's a natural byproduct of function of membership. So as I've cycled around membership organisations over the last 10, 12 years, usually what happens after a member has not renewed can be recited quite easily. We contact the member 3 times and at 3 months we lapse them. It's a fairly common approach, and certainly the technology solutions in the market are a little bit more rigid in terms of supporting you through that 1, 2, 3, 4 lapse process. So it's certainly more common. But I think there's definitely room for improvement in how that takes place. Often quite transactional. It is that 1, 2, 3 methodical way of doing it, and quite often it's a mass communication. We'll use the same channels, which will differ from organisation to organisation. Some will send a renewal letter followed by an email reminder, or vice versa, but typically it's a one-size-fits-all process of we're going to go out in this particular way. And so again, utilising marketing tools. I noticed in the chat that somebody's mentioned MailChimp and engagement scores and so on that tool. Those sorts of tools are great at creating programs which allow you to filter your members through conditions and automate follow-ups. So again, it won't surprise you that we're going to talk a little bit about segmentation again at this stage, to try and break down that mass communication approach. So in terms of consideration for your reactive retention strategies, some proactive activity is always going to be useful. So always good practice to be performing regular data hygiene checks. So we did a session on engagement and collection of data a few weeks ago, but I suppose just at a high level, having key data points and making sure that members have completed and kept up to date with their email address, phone number, address, and so on is a great way of ensuring that you can reach that member at this point in time. And also tracking members' desired form of communication, I think, is really important as well. So that might be overt in terms of communication preferences. Do you prefer to be contacted by email, phone, etc.? But also taking a look at how they've interacted through their renewal year. So have they been clicking through on our emails? Have they made calls into the organisation? Are other ways of understanding how the member has been interacting or not interacting? And as we reflected on this particular area as we was devising today's session, we discussed some of our own experiences with member organisations, and there was a great example from one of our team members who was a member of a membership organisation to perform a qualification as a student member, became an associate member to carry on learning, but ultimately their membership lapsed. And when we drilled into that a little bit more, the reason behind that was that the person didn't realise actually that their membership was due for renewal. And when we looked into it, there were emails sent from the organisation reminding, and the renewal notice was sent by email, but that email address wasn't checked very often. It was in amongst a load of the sort of email marketing campaigns that I'm sure we all receive all the time. Quite simply, wasn't a massively engaged member, but enjoyed the content and all that was going on, and missed that renewal. And it was only when a letter was sent in the post lapsing process that person actually realized, oh, my membership's lapsed. And we all know that once you've lost a customer, it's harder to bring them back than it is to proactively retain them. So we just thought that was a really interesting way of seeing that the one size fits all approach to email lapse didn't work in that instance, and a member was lost as a result. So just to finish off on this slide, pre-planning across communication channels, what those follow-ups look like, how you're going to make sure that you get in contact with that member is all important. And marketing tools in this particular area are your friend. It is possible to automate those. And I was looking at a large membership organization's program using the digital email tool whilst preparing for the session. That was a great example of feeding people through various communication channels, completely automated, based on their reaction to the information that they were sent. So in that instance, the organisation chose to send an email to all members, waited a period of time to see had that been clicked, sent a follow-up email, and if there was still no activity, they would then trigger a text message to try and do that by another means. So, and completely automated, rolling renewals, and therefore lapsing is taking place all of the time. their staff members no longer have to get involved with triggering those communications based on the activity. It is possible to perform those triggers. So picking up on a similar example to that we used in the proactive retention strategy, we've used the similar slide imagery to show how we might perform a retention strategy. So in terms of segmentation, this time around, we've moved past our highly engaged members, because logic dictates that those people will have almost renewed. Yeah, there might be some anomalies, but let's take it as read as that's the case. And it's our disengaged group that we now want to react to and perform different strategies based on the information that we know of them. So we may have data on our regular website users, people who are likely to log in, and we've seen some great interventions around popping up renewal banners, or maybe preventing services from being used, really signposting through the site that there is a renewal due and routing people into a user journey to get them to pay for that. By way of example, if somebody has a high email click-through rate, or has expressed a preference for email communication, logically an email is hopefully going to bring them back to the table and get them renewing. But if that isn't the case, and we've got individuals that have regularly called service desk, for example, then a phone call to those people, picking up on Ed's proactive retention strategies and picking the right cohort, rather than mass communication through channels that isn't going to maybe work quickly, routing those people out towards a phone call and trying to get them to renew that way seems like a logical route at that stage. And then if there's little interaction at all, then the way in which you interact with that person may be slightly different. So minimal, little written communication, picking up on our real life example from earlier. And again, these aren't if you have a regular website visitor, just do this. We're not mandated anyway that these are the correct ways of doing it. The communication strategy will need to be tailored to each individual organisation. It really is conceptual in terms of how you might approach that, and that the key takeaway being there, using the data, using the intelligence to segment and push people into the best possible route to interaction. And just before I finish on this section, of course, what we're looking to do then is use the data collected through those processes to measure success, and then refine our strategies so that we are communicating in a different way. So if a phone call or an email hasn't worked, for example, is that worth a follow-up phone call to that cohort of people that have not reacted? And the specifics of the communication strategy will be relevant to your organisation there. So just in terms of a couple of key takeaways, timing is really important here. We know that period of bringing people back to the table is relatively short. So using the most optimum communication strategy for your segment to get to those people as quick as possible and alert them to a problem is going to give you the best chance of ultimately retaining that membership. Personalization and underpinning value through that process is also really important. So it's one thing defining the channel of communication. It's also really key then to be able to remind people of the value through value statementing, through reminders of the services used, to show the value that people have been taking through that membership. And normally that's something that's really quite difficult for organizations that do have organizational membership. And tying back employees of that organization, utilizing that service and reminding that organization that their employees are driving value, but you haven't renewed your membership for whatever reason is really important. Monitoring that retention rate and performance of those strategies is obviously vital to, do we need to refine the strategy itself, or do we need to take another approach with this segment, this cohort of people, to bring them back to the table? And as I've already suggested, optimization and automation wherever possible is really key to making the most of your resources and driving that retention. So we're going to move into our final poll here. And our question is, how likely are you to regularly, i.e. within 12 months, review your lapsing process? And our options there are very unlikely, unlikely, neutral, likely, and very likely. So to read that again, how likely are you to regularly, i.e. within 12 months, review your lapsing process or strategy? Very unlikely, unlikely, neutral, likely, or very likely. A few moments for those results to come in. So that's really interesting. It looks like we're moving towards a likely answer there, which is great, and perhaps comes back to my point around lapsing being a little bit more strategically laid out than proactive retention strategies. And hopefully the last few minutes give some good tips and experiences on room for improvement and buying into that review of the lapsing process.
Okay, Steve, do you want me to take them through this quickly, and then we'll move to the Q&A, I think, and we've got sort of 10 minutes, so hopefully there's enough time. So just very quickly to recap, so 6 sort of key things we just wanted to summarise the whole session. There's this overlap inevitably of engagement and what we talked about in proactive. There's a lot of synergy there with an engagement strategy, and essentially good retention is good engagement, so there is a lot of overlap there. So it's not a byproduct of good engagement is therefore good retention. It's sort of, they're both the same thing really, and that's how you should be thinking about your proactive retention strategies. But the kind of takeaway there would be measuring it and actually being understanding, are those strategies having an impact on the retention itself? So using that retention rate.
Yeah, I think just to chip in there, Ed, I think it's the subtle difference is the gathering of feedback, the reminder of value, the propensity to renew, whereas engagement maybe traditionally is more around giving people a personalized experience, making sure that they're aware of products and services. So it's all good engagement, it's all interaction with the member, but retention strategies should have that focus on, of course, retention as opposed to promoting and interacting with the member.
Okay, thanks, Steve. We've said it a huge amount in this session, but your segmentation, so hopefully there's a few examples, food for thought in terms of how you might want to go about considering that. Obviously having good structured data and being able to track those data points, touch points with your members is going to be important there. So being able to track website visits, those sorts of things. The strategy, so try and think of those in terms of proactive and reactive, because again, they complement each other. There's a lot of overlap there, but thinking about how you could differentiate those segments within those different areas. We've said this before, but monitoring the performance over time, seeing that's obviously encouraging to, if you're going to put effort into something, that can inform your return on investment. It can also inform whether it's having a positive impact or not. Regularly review your process. So we just asked the question about reviewing your lapse process, for example, but being willing to do that review on a semi-regular basis is really important, whether that's reviewing your segmentation, reviewing your strategies and so on. And then just a general touch point is gather insights wherever possible. So this really is a takeaway of speaking to your members. If a member is choosing to lapse and you do manage to get them on the phone, ask why they didn't get the communication. So you might find out some little things that will help you refine your strategies. Even I didn't know I was getting my emails, they were going into my unfocused folder or something like that. So it just might be useful. Don't forget the sort of human touch and asking your members questions or doing a bit of Q&A if they do decide to not renew. So hopefully that's covered the key points and that session was helpful. This was on our slide last time, but just a quick, if you were on the last session, you might have got a copy of our new member engagement ebook, but this is free for you to have. So we'll be doing a circular after the back of this If you're interested, you could drop a comment in the chat as well, but we'll definitely take the attendees away and send this out to those that we haven't already sent it to. I'm just hurtling through this because I want to get to this section, which is the Q&A, and also just a quick also promo is that Steve and I are both going to be at the Digital Excellence Conference coming up in May. And so, yeah, please come over if you see us. I don't know if I'll wear red that day as well, but I'll usually stand out. So anyway, it'd be great to meet some of you in person. I think Steve will be doing a breakout seminar as well. So sort of taking away what we've learned from these sessions to sort of inform the content for that one as well.
Ed will be the tallest person in the room. Not hard to spot.
I'll make sure of it. Right, so questions, Q&A. Do we have any questions? I think there's a couple things.
We do indeed. First question from Beth. Are there any other variables you consider when segmenting a third of new members to call, aside from not opening emails or transacting? What are some of the other typical things that you're looking at?
Go on and let you go first.
Well, obviously, it really depends on the organisation. I think demographic does make an impact. Obviously, we mentioned about assumptions, and so you do have to make a few guesses initially and see. So I think it's also looking at data of those that are leaving and seeing if there's any patterns amongst that, and then applying that thinking to new joiners, where those joiners originated from as well, if you're collecting that information. So is it an upgrade of a student membership, for example, or is it a brand new person joining the organisation? So it's a bit tricky to do, and it's definitely one of those things to refine over time. But yeah, look at past history potentially and use that to try and inform any patterns or things that there's overlap. Steve, did you want to also?
Yeah, I think just to build on that in terms of maybe not new joiners quite so much, but for people who have been a member for a longer period of time, is using that behavioural information that websites can collect and using it for good in terms of this person is heavily engaged, building that into the segment and routing those in and getting most bang for your buck on, okay, this person joined 6 months ago and we can see they haven't logged into the site since. That suggests that data may no longer be up to date. They've joined tactically and aren't seeking value. Therefore, we want to give those people a call.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sarah's got a great question. What are the typical preferences for member comms? Because she's saying that they're still using email rather than post or SMS. It used to be, would you like to receive text messages from us? That was the original list of channels. Has it changed a huge amount, or are people still using those?
I think my view on this has changed over the last couple of years, actually, that it hasn't moved forward that great. I mean, obviously, new communication channels don't come out all the time. You maybe have WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and those sorts of channels that you can reach members on more commonly, but communication preference is actually something that is quite troublesome for organisations, especially when we cycle into new organisations. We don't know how our members want to be contacted, and more importantly, we don't know what their preferences are. Is still a key driver for, or success factor for, new CRM implementations. So certainly the tools are out there to reach people further than post, email, SMS, the sort of channels that we all use, the capabilities there to do so. And then it comes down to resources preference internally as to what channels you ultimately choose to use. But I think the key takeaway, as we had in the last session where we talked about chatbots, which built a lot of traction, was it's not necessarily about defining this is the best channel, it's what is the best channel for this segment of people. And again, chatbots may be a great way of moving people towards questions on retention almost, which I haven't thought about until I started answering this question, but I don't want to get labelled as chatbots all the way as started to happen.
Yeah, we got very chatbot heavy in the last one, didn't we?
We certainly did. The key,
don't want to leap on the chatbot bandwagon again.
Yeah, the key concept with all of our solving membership points here is that it's not about mandating this is the best way of doing it. It's how do you arrive through data, through strategy, to the best way of interacting with your membership and performing that acquisition, retention, engagement is the essence of our solutions.
Yeah. And a great final question from Beth, actually, which is, it's about, you know, is there, when we have all these touch points before renewal, you know, is there a standard, we need to contact them 3 times before renewal, and then when they fall into a lapse segment? I don't think I've ever seen a kind of standard, well, we talk to them 3 times before we expect them to renew kind of thing. I think it probably is different per organisation. And it feels like actually what's more standard is, well, actually, first of all, we send out an email. If we don't get an email response, then we send out some posts. Then if we don't get a post response, then we ring you. So all the time it's getting a narrower, because it's actually more expensive the more you use those channels.
And certainly post renewal, that's where hopefully the takeaway is that it feels quite often, and it's quite mandated. It's usually if you're going into a new session with an organisation, it's a case of it's somebody in the membership department that can rattle off that process because it's done every single year, and it will change per organisation. It might be 3 communications, 6 communications, but we will follow those steps as we feel it gives us the best chance of renewal. But ultimately, it's not data driven. It's not necessarily, it's tactical. It's not necessarily an omni-channel. We'll go from here to here and move that around. It's a case of exactly as you say, it's an email to a phone call to a letter. And in that example that we used of the lapse member, the letter was only sent post lapse to inform people formally, and that was what got the attention. If that letter had never have gone out, it was like, oh, I didn't renew my membership. So that suggests that by looking into that a bit deeper and catching that up front, that for that segment of people, sending that communication straight after the renewal, or even posting the renewal letter that can feel old hat at times, might be a better way of proactively getting that retention ultimately.
And apologies to anyone whose questions we didn't manage to answer. We will forward the questions and who asked them on to Militech as well, so that they can continue to have a conversation with you about your questions. So thanks for that, guys.
Perfect, no problem.
Excellent.
Okay. So thanks, Kerry, for expertly putting those questions to our speakers for today, and thank you for taking the time to answer those, Steve and Ed. So a big thank you to Militech for sponsoring today's session. We couldn't have done it without you. And just to iterate to everybody that after today's session, the on-demand version will be supplied by Militech along with the presentation slides, and I believe a link to get the ebook. Is that right, Steve?
I believe so.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks for your time. And I think we're taking a little bit of a break from the webcasts when it comes to digital excellence over the next couple of weeks. So if you just bear with us, we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time. And if you can attend the conference, it'd be great to see you there. And as I say, I believe Militech will be providing a discount code in the email that you'll get after today's session. So please do come and see us all if you're around. And thanks for attending. So goodbye.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.